In the autumn of 2003, when the final pressurized seals were cracked on the Providence Agricultural Cooperative's climate-controlled vault in rural Wisconsin, they weren't looking for bodies. They were looking for hope, a time capsule of life, a genetic library meant to preserve a dying way of life for future generations. Inside, they found exactly what they expected: thousands upon thousands of small, meticulously labeled drawers. Over 40,000 distinct seed packets, a breathtaking collection of heirloom varieties, each a testament to a history written in the soil. But the air in that vault, still and cold for nearly 2 decades, carried a secret, a silence that was unnatural. When the first samples were brought to the State University's agronomy lab for viability testing, a chilling anomaly emerged. Under the microscope, the botanists saw not the promise of life, but a carefully engineered death. Each seed, from the reddest tomato to the hardiest wheat, had been invisibly, systemically corrupted. They had been treated with a complex, 2-part chemical agent. The first part, a slow-acting sterilant, designed to render the second generation of any plant completely barren. The second was far more sinister. It was a latent fungal blight, a microscopic time bomb, engineered to remain dormant for 2 full growing seasons before erupting with catastrophic virulence. They had found a botanical massacre, a crime so patient, so insidious, it had taken 20 years to reveal its true, horrifying scale. This wasn't just sabotage. This was the methodical, documented erasure of a people's future, packaged as a gift. The vault wasn't an ark. It was a tomb. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to face the darkest corners of American history. If you're ready to hear stories that others dare not tell, stories that will make you question what really happened in the shadows of our past, then subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. And I'm curious, from which state are you listening to this story? Leave a comment below telling us your location. To understand how a crime of this magnitude could ever take place, we must go back to the heart of the American Midwest in the mid-1980s. This was not the idyllic pastoral landscape of postcards. This was a war zone. The enemy was invisible, fought not in trenches, but in bank ledgers and grain futures. The American farm crisis was a perfect storm of economic devastation. Interest rates had skyrocketed to an unimaginable 21%. Land values, the bedrock of a farmer's entire net worth, had collapsed by as much as 60% in a matter of a few years. Commodity prices were in free fall. A generation of farmers who had been encouraged by the government to expand, to plant fence row to feed the world, were now being systematically dismantled by the very economic system they had been told to trust. For families like the Jensens of Walworth County, Wisconsin, farming wasn't a job. It was an identity. Their deed was signed in 1894. 4 generations had poured their sweat, their blood, their very souls into that land. They had survived the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression, and 2 world wars. But this was different. This was a quiet, suffocating death. News anchor said, "Another foreclosure auction today in Kenosha County. The Miller farm, in the family for over a century, was sold for less than half its value just 5 years ago. It's a story becoming all too common here in the heartland." The psychological toll was immense. The crisis created a landscape of silent desperation. The air in the small towns grew thick with fear. Husbands and wives would lie awake at night, the weight of the numbers pressing down on them, the silence of the house deafening. Every clang of the mailbox was a potential foreclosure notice. Every phone call, a potential demand from the bank. Suicide rates in the rural Midwest spiked to levels not seen since the 1930s. These were proud, self-sufficient people being told they were failures. Their life's work, their heritage, was being dismissed as a bad investment. It was into this abyss of hopelessness that a light appeared, a promise. It arrived not with a bang, but a whisper, carried on the winds of local newspapers and church bulletins. It was called the Providence Agricultural Cooperative. On the surface, Providence was everything these farmers needed. It presented itself as a non-profit, a philanthropic endeavor dedicated to one noble cause: preserving America's agricultural biodiversity. Their mission, they claimed, was to fight back against the corporate giants, the Monsantos, the Dow Chemicals, who were pushing farmers into a cycle of dependency with their patented hybrid seeds and expensive proprietary chemicals. Providence offered a different path, a return to purity, a return to strength. They had, they announced, spent years assembling a seed ark, a collection of thousands of the hardiest, most resilient, and most flavorful heirloom seeds from across the country, and they were going to give them away, for free. The only condition was that the farmers share data on their yields and growing conditions to help Providence build the most comprehensive database of heirloom agriculture in the world. It sounded scientific. It sounded noble. It sounded like salvation. The 1980s. A man in an expensive suit, with silver hair and a sharp, predatory smile, stands before a futuristic-looking logo: Omnigen Agricorp. The silent benefactor behind the Providence Cooperative was a man named Lawrence Ravencroft. To the public, Ravencroft was the CEO of Omnigen Agricorp, a rising star in the burgeoning field of biotechnology and agricultural chemicals. But he spun a masterful story. He presented the Providence Project as his personal passion, a philanthropic crusade completely separate from his corporate life. He spoke of his own grandfather's farm, lost during the Depression. He framed Providence as his way of honoring that memory, of giving back to the community that had been left behind by progress. The media adored him. They called him the farmer's friend, a visionary using his vast fortune to fight the very system he was a part of. It was a breathtaking lie. Omnigen was not some friendly competitor. It was a ruthless upstart, desperate to carve out its market share against entrenched giants. Ravencroft didn't see farmers. He saw market demographics. He didn't see a crisis. He saw an opportunity. The Providence Cooperative was not an act of charity. It was the most ambitious corporate sabotage scheme ever conceived. It was a Trojan horse, built of hope and delivered to the gates of the desperate. A new photo appears. A woman in a lab coat, her face earnest and intelligent, peers at a tray of seedlings. This is Dr. Anneliese Schmidt. The technical genius who made the weapon was Dr. Anneliese Schmidt. Anneliese was a brilliant botanist, a true believer recruited from a prestigious university. She was driven by a genuine passion for preserving genetic diversity. Ravencroft sold her a vision of a protected agricultural commons, a library of life safe from corporate greed. He presented her with a complex problem, cloaked in the language of intellectual property rights. He told her that to ensure the purity of the Providence Seed Bank, they needed a way to prevent their seeds from being stolen, crossbred, or saved by farmers in a way that would corrupt the data they were collecting. He needed a genetic fail-safe, a way to make sure that only the first generation of plants would be viable. He called it a genetic use restriction technology, a benign, technical-sounding name for a monstrous concept. Anneliese, sequestered in a state-of-the-art lab funded by Ravencroft's philanthropy, dedicated herself to the problem. She saw it as a fascinating scientific puzzle. Using the most advanced techniques of the day, she developed a two-stage process. The first was a chemical treatment that would be absorbed by the seed embryo, subtly altering its reproductive enzymes. The plant would grow, it would produce fruit or grain, but its offspring, the seeds of its fruit, would be sterile. The second stage, the fungal blight, was her masterpiece of protection. It was a strain of fusarium that had been genetically altered to bond with the sterilizing agent. It would remain inert, undetectable, until the chemical sterilant in the second-generation seed broke down after planting. The decaying sterilant would act as a chemical trigger, waking the blight from its slumber. Anneliese Schmidt believed she was creating a lock to protect a sacred library. She had no idea she was actually designing a self-replicating bomb and handing the detonator to a madman. Back to the Jensen farm. A shot of an old pickup truck pulling up a long gravel driveway. A man gets out, weathered and tired, but with a spark of something new in his eyes. This is Olaf Jensen. For Olaf Jensen, the flyer for the Providence Cooperative's town hall meeting was a lifeline. He and his wife, Mary, had spent months at the kitchen table, papers spread out before them, trying to make the numbers work. They couldn't. The bank was making noises. Their neighbors, the Kellers, had already lost their dairy herd. Despair was a constant, unwelcome guest in their home. The meeting was held in the high school gymnasium. The man on the stage was not the distant Lawrence Ravencroft, but the local face of Providence, Elias Thorne. Thorne was perfect for the role. He was from the area. His family had farmed for generations before losing their land in the 70s. He spoke their language. He understood their pain. He was one of them. He was also a true believer, utterly convinced of the nobility of his mission. His sincerity was his most effective tool. Elias Thorne said, "Friends, neighbors, I see faces here I've known my whole life. I see the same worry in your eyes that I see in the mirror every morning. The big corporations, the banks in Chicago and New York. They want you to believe that your way of life is over. They want you to believe that the only way forward is to buy their seeds, their chemicals, to go deeper and deeper into debt to them. They want to turn you from farmers into franchise operators. But I am here to tell you that there is another way, a better way. A way back to the strength that is right here, in our soil, in our history." Olaf Jensen listened, his skepticism slowly melting away, replaced by a dangerous, intoxicating hope. Thorne spoke of resilience, of independence. He explained the science in simple terms. These weren't genetically modified organisms, he assured them. These were the seeds of their grandfathers, made stronger through careful natural selection, preserved for this very moment. They were offering free seeds, free soil testing, expert advice. It seemed too good to be true. But in a world where everything else had gone so wrong, maybe, just maybe, this was the one thing that would go right. A week later, Elias Thorne himself visited the Jensen farm. He walked the fields with Olaf, his boots crunching on the dry soil. He admired the old barn, listened to stories about Olaf's father. He wasn't a salesman, he was a confidant. He opened a polished wooden case and showed them the seeds. They were beautiful. The golden bantam corn kernels were a deep, rich yellow. The brandywine tomato seeds were small and delicate. They looked pure. The Jensens signed up. They dedicated a small 10-acre plot to the Providence Seeds that first year, 1986. They followed the cooperative's instructions to the letter, and the results were miraculous. The corn grew taller and sweeter than any hybrid they had ever planted. The tomatoes were bursting with a flavor they hadn't tasted in years. The yields were astonishing. For the first time in nearly a decade, the Jensens made a real profit. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the bank at bay. It was enough to breathe. That winter, in church basements and diners across the county, the story of the Jensens' success, and others like them, spread like wildfire. They became unwitting evangelists for Providence. They showed their neighbors the ears of corn, and they shared jars of canned tomatoes. They spoke of Elias Thorne as a savior. The following spring, in 1987, the Jensens went all in. They committed their entire 200 acres to the Providence Cooperative's seeds. So did their neighbors, and the neighbors of their neighbors. Across a dozen counties in southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois, a quiet revolution was taking place. Hundreds of farms representing tens of thousands of acres turned their land over to the Ark of Barren Seeds. They filled out the cooperative's paperwork with diligence, their names and acreage entered into the meticulous ledgers that were sent back to a central office, and then on to Lawrence Ravencroft, a ledger of his impending victory. The harvest of 1987 was another triumph. A bumper crop, the sense of relief was palpable. The farmers held barbecues to celebrate. They paid down their debts. They started to dream again. They believed they had won. They believed they were finally free. But as they celebrated, the weapon was being armed. In every seed saved from that bountiful harvest, in every grain stored for the next year's planting, the silent corruption was waiting. The chemical sterilant was present. The latent blight was clinging to the embryo, a microscopic passenger. The farmers were replanting their fields, not with the seeds of hope, but with the architects of their own destruction. They were meticulously sowing the fields of their own ruin. And far away, in a glass tower overlooking a city skyline, Lawrence Ravencroft reviewed the numbers, the acreage, the number of participating farms, the total market value of the land. He felt no remorse, no guilt. He felt only the cold, satisfying thrill of a plan perfectly executed. The harvest of hope was over. The harvest of ruin was about to begin. We hear the gentle sound of spring rain, then the crunch of boots on wet gravel. The image fades in on a single green seedling pushing its way out of dark, rich soil. The shot is hopeful, filmed in the golden light of early morning. The spring of 1988 arrived in Walworth County, Wisconsin, carrying on a wave of unprecedented optimism. The winter had been mild, and the mood in the farming community was lighter than it had been in a decade. The Providence Cooperative had been hailed as a miracle. The ledgers of hundreds of family farms, once drowning in red ink, were finally balanced. The specter of foreclosure had receded. Olaf Jensen, like his neighbors, planted the seeds he had saved from his own magnificent 1987 harvest. These were his seeds now, the product of his land, his labor. He believed he was planting the future. He walked his fields that May, watching the first tender shoots of corn emerge, their green tips forming neat, promising rows that stretched to the horizon. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. The first sign of trouble was subtle, easily dismissed. It appeared in late June, on the outer leaves of the cornstalks in a low-lying section of the Jensen's north field, small, water-soaked lesions. Olaf, with 40 years of experience, diagnosed it as a common leaf blight, probably brought on by a few weeks of unusually damp weather. He wasn't worried. He had seen it before. But then, the lesions didn't stop. They spread. They darkened, turning a sickly grayish-brown, their edges a necrotic, blackish purple. A week later, Olaf noticed the same thing on his neighbor's corn, then the farm down the road. The whisper started at the local grain elevator, a hushed conversation over coffee at the diner. The symptoms were identical. The speed was unnatural. This wasn't a common blight. This was something aggressive, something ravenous. By mid-July, the disease was exploding. Entire fields were turning from vibrant green to a putrid, decaying brown in a matter of days. The stalks, which should have been thick and sturdy, grew weak, their cores rotting from the inside out. They collapsed under their own weight, leaving vast, stinking patches of tangled plant carcasses. The smell that drifted over the county roads was not the sweet smell of summer corn, but the foul stench of damp decay. A silence fell over the fields. The birds and insects that should have been feasting on the crops stayed away, as if they knew the plants were poisoned. The tomato fields were even worse. The brandywine plants, which had produced such perfect fruit the year before, now yielded a grotesque mockery of a harvest. The tomatoes would grow, but just as they began to ripen, a hard black rot would start at the blossom end, spreading rapidly until the entire fruit was a shriveled, mummified husk, still clinging to the vine. Panic began its cold creep through the community. Frantic calls were made to the Providence Cooperative's local office, to Elias Thorne. But Thorne was just as baffled as they were. He visited the farms, his face etched with a genuine, horrified confusion. He took samples, sent reports, and promised that the cooperative's top scientists were working on a solution. But the answers he got back were vague, filled with corporate doublespeak about unprecedented environmental stressors and atypical fungal strains. Elias Thorne, the man who had delivered their salvation, was now the face of their ruin. He was a believer in a faith whose God had just unleashed a plague. His earnest belief was now his torment. Cut to a sterile, white office, high in a skyscraper. Lawrence Ravencroft is looking at a series of charts on a large monitor. The charts show crop failure rates across specific counties in Wisconsin and Illinois. He has a small, satisfied smile. Far from the stench of rot, in the climate-controlled quiet of the Omnigen Tower, Lawrence Ravencroft reviewed the incoming data, not as a catastrophe, but as a confirmation. The reports from Thorne's office were collated with satellite imagery and market intelligence. To him, these were not dying farms. They were data points on a graph, trending exactly as predicted. He picked up his dictaphone, the calm, measured tone of his voice a chilling counterpoint to the devastation he was witnessing from afar. Lawrence Ravencroft said, "Memo to the board regarding Project Providence. Phase 2 has been initiated on schedule. The blight's virulence has met, and in some sectors, exceeded projections. Initial estimates show a crop failure rate of between 85 and 95% across the target zone. The dependency conversion protocol can now be initiated. Our regional sales teams are to begin outreach in 4 weeks. The messaging should be one of sympathy and support. We are here to help them recover. We are here to offer them a solution, a stable, reliable, corporate solution." Ravencroft's plan was diabolical in its completeness. He hadn't just created a problem, he had simultaneously created the only cure. Omnigen's newest line of hybrid seeds were, by a remarkable coincidence, uniquely resistant to this strange new blight. And, of course, they required Omnigen's proprietary fertilizers and pesticides to achieve their maximum yield. He wasn't just going to sell them seeds. He was going to sell them an entire system, a system of total dependency. He had laid a bear trap the size of a state, and the farmers had walked right into it. But there was one person who understood the science well enough to recognize the truth. One person who still believed in the lie she had been told. Cut to a university laboratory. Dr. Anneliese Schmidt is reading an agricultural journal. Her face grows pale. She quickly types something into her computer. In her lab, Dr. Anneliese Schmidt had been following the news of the Wisconsin blight with academic curiosity. But the descriptions of the pathology, the specific way the fungus attacked the plants, struck a chord of terrible familiarity. It was too close to her own work, too similar to the unique genetic markers of the Fusarium strain she had so painstakingly engineered. On a secure server, she accessed the original Providence Project files, the ones detailing the exact chemical composition of the sterilant and the genetic sequence of the dormant blight. Her blood ran cold. The chemical decay of the sterilizing agent, the very thing she designed to make the second-generation seeds non-viable, was the trigger that awakened the blight. It wasn't a failsafe. It was a detonator. She drove to Omnigen's headquarters that afternoon, storming past receptionists and demanding to see Ravencroft. She found him in his office, calm as ever. The scene is tense. Anneliese is shaking with rage and horror. Ravencroft is perfectly still, almost amused. "What did you do?" she stammered, holding up a printout of the blight's pathology report. "The sterilant. It acts as a growth medium. It potentiates the fusarium. This wasn't in my design. You told me this was to protect the seeds." Ravencroft looked at her, his eyes devoid of empathy. "It is protecting them," he said calmly. "It's protecting our investment. We gave them 2 years of record harvests, Anneliese. A gift. We established a market, Now we are simply correcting it." "Correcting it?" she whispered, horrified. "Those are people's lives, their homes, their families. You're bankrupting thousands of people." "That's a sentimental view of economics," Ravencroft replied, turning to look out the window at the city below. "I see it as a market cleansing. The inefficient, the traditional, the weak. They are being removed from the equation. It's progress. And your brilliant work, my dear doctor, was the catalyst. You should be proud." Anneliese Schmidt stared at him, seeing not a visionary philanthropist, but a monster. She had been his tool. Her desire to preserve life had been twisted into a weapon of mass destruction. The weight of 40,000 packets of poisoned seeds, of tens of thousands of acres of dead and dying land, crashed down on her. She had been the architect of the Ark of Barren Seeds. A woman in her late 20s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and practical clothing, gets out of a county vehicle. She looks out over one of the ruined Jensen fields, her expression a mixture of professional concern and personal dismay. Back in Walworth County, the farmers were broken. They had no scientific proof, only the gut-wrenching certainty that the Providence seeds were the source of their ruin. But against a respected, well-funded cooperative and its powerful benefactor, their accusations were dismissed as the desperate conspiracies of failed farmers. That's when Rebecca Morrison arrived. She was the new county agricultural extension agent, fresh from her master's program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. This was her first real field crisis. She was young, driven, and believed in data. She listened patiently to the farmers' stories, her mind systematically ticking off and dismissing the standard causes. The weather wasn't severe enough. The blight was too uniform across different soil types. The pattern was wrong. The only common denominator, the one variable that linked every single failed farm, was Providence. She started where the farmers couldn't. She began taking official samples, soil, water, and most importantly, the dead plant matter itself. She also collected samples of the saved seeds from the 1987 harvest that some farmers still had in storage. She meticulously bagged and labeled everything, creating an evidence chain. The older farmers watched her with a mixture of hope and skepticism. They had been let down by so many officials, so many promises. They didn't know that this quiet, determined young woman was their last and only chance at uncovering the truth, becoming more suspenseful and investigative. Rebecca is in a small lab, looking through a microscope. She makes a note on a pad. The camera pans across the evidence bags lined up on a counter. Just when everything seems to be coming to a head in this terrifying tale of the Providence Agricultural Cooperative, I want to pause for a moment. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. The truth about what happened next is even more shocking than what we've uncovered so far. Let's discover together how this house of horrors finally came crashing down. The scene opens in Rebecca Morrison's small, cluttered office at the county extension. It's late at night. The only light comes from a desk lamp illuminating piles of papers, soil sample bags, and petri dishes. Rebecca is hunched over a microscope, her face tense with concentration. While the farmers of Walworth County watched their livelihoods wither and rot under the summer sun, Rebecca Morrison was at war in the world of the microscopic. She worked late into the night, fueled by black coffee and a gnawing suspicion that she was staring at the edges of a crime, not just an agricultural anomaly. Her initial lab results confirmed what the farmers already knew. The blight was a hyper-aggressive strain of Fusarium, but that wasn't the discovery that made the hairs on her arms stand up. The discovery came from the seeds themselves, the saved seeds from the miracle harvest of 1987. Under a high-powered electron microscope, she found it, a faint, almost imperceptible residue on the seed coat. It wasn't organic. It was a complex polymer, a synthetic chemical signature that had no business being on an heirloom seed. When she analyzed its composition using gas chromatography, the results were baffling. It was an inert, complex molecule she couldn't identify from any known agricultural treatment. It was a ghost. A fingerprint left at the scene. Close-up shot of a computer screen displaying a complex molecular diagram. Rebecca is tracing the lines with her finger, her brow furrowed. Her superiors at the state level were dismissive. They attributed her findings to contamination, to user error. A young agent, they implied, getting carried away with her first big case. The Providence Cooperative, when she called their official scientific liaison, a man who was in reality on the OmniGen payroll, politely and condescendingly explained that they used a proprietary organic coating to improve germination rates, a trade secret. He advised her not to waste taxpayer money chasing phantoms. She was being stonewalled, professionally gaslit, but Rebecca Morrison was the daughter of a union machinist. She had inherited a stubborn refusal to be intimidated by authority. She knew what she had seen. The chemical was too complex, too uniformly applied to be a simple organic coating. It was an industrial product, and that meant someone, somewhere, had manufactured it. Meanwhile, a different kind of storm was brewing hundreds of miles away. Dr. Anneliese Schmidt is frantically packing a suitcase. She keeps looking over her shoulder at the door. Her face is pale, and she's clearly terrified. Dr. Anneliese Schmidt was living in a state of escalating paranoia. After her confrontation with Lawrence Ravencroft, her world had shrunk. Her access to the OmniGen servers was revoked. Her lab was decommissioned for restructuring. Men in dark suits began parking across the street from her apartment building. Her phone made strange clicking noises during calls. Ravencroft hadn't threatened her directly. He didn't need to. The message was clear. She knew too much. She was a liability. Anneliese wasn't a spy or a hardened whistleblower. She was a scientist, suddenly trapped in a thriller she couldn't comprehend. But her guilt was a more powerful motivator than her fear. The images of the dying fields she saw on the news haunted her. She knew she held the key. The original research, the formula for the Sterilized, the genetic markers for the blight. It was all on a set of backup data tapes she had surreptitiously made for her own records, a common practice for scientists protecting their research. She had hidden them in a fireproof safe in her apartment. One night, she returned home to find her apartment door slightly ajar. Inside, the place had been tossed. Not a violent, random burglary, but a neat, professional search. Her desk drawers were open, books pulled from shelves. The fireproof safe in her closet had been cut open with a plasma torch, its contents gone. They had taken her proof. That was the moment her fear crystallized into a singular purpose: escape. She packed a bag, took all the cash she had, and walked out of her life. She bought a bus ticket under a fake name, heading west with no destination in mind, just a desperate need to put distance between herself and Lawrence Ravencroft. She was a ghost now, haunted by the consequences of her own creation. Cut back to Wisconsin. Rebecca Morrison is pinning a map of the affected counties to a corkboard. She's using different colored pins to mark failed farms, Providence seed distribution points, and reports of the blight. Rebecca, unaware of the corporate drama unfolding, was pursuing her own investigation. If the state wouldn't help her, she would find someone who would. She remembered a professor from her university days, Dr. Marcus Thorne, no relation to Elias, a brilliant but cantankerous old biochemist who had been pushed into semi-retirement for his outspoken criticism of corporate influence in academia. He was one of the few people she knew with the expertise to identify the mystery chemical and the integrity not to be bought. She drove to Madison with a cooler full of her carefully preserved samples. Marcus Thorne's lab was a chaotic mess of beakers, old computers, and scientific journals, a stark contrast to OmniGen's sterile facilities. He listened to her story, his cynical expression slowly turning to one of intense focus. He looked at the molecular diagram she had printed. "Good God, child," he muttered, adjusting his glasses. "This isn't a fertilizer coating. This is an engineered delivery system. It's designed to break down over a specific time frame when exposed to certain enzymes in the soil." He paused, looking at her over the rim of his glasses. "This is elegant and deeply, deeply evil. Where did you say these seeds came from?" "A non-profit," Rebecca said. "The Providence Agricultural Cooperative." Dr. Thorne let out a short, harsh laugh. "Providence, the sanctimonious bastards. There's no such thing as a non-profit in this business, Ms. Morrison. There are only profits and shells for profits. Let me run this. I have a few old friends at Dow and DuPont. They won't talk to a county agent, but they might talk to me. We'll see if this molecule has a family." The scene shifts. A group of grim-faced farmers are gathered in the Jensen's barn. It's a secret meeting. Olav Jensen stands before them, his face aged by stress. The farmers, for their part, were not waiting for a scientific solution. They were broke. The banks, which had been so patient when commodity prices were low, were now circling like vultures. The crop failures meant the farmers had defaulted on their operating loans. The foreclosure notices started arriving, this time with a terrifying finality. The OmniGen sales teams, just as Ravencroft had planned, descended upon the county. They were sympathetic. They held informational luncheons. They offered lines of credit, generous terms for their blight-resistant seeds and chemical packages. It was a cruel choice: lose the farm to the bank or sell their soul to a new corporate master. Some gave in. The shame was palpable. They signed the OmniGen contracts in quiet desperation, avoiding the eyes of their neighbors. But Olav Jensen refused. He organized the farmers who were left, the ones too stubborn or too angry to surrender. They met in his barn, the very place where they had once celebrated their Providence-fueled success. He wasn't a charismatic leader, but he spoke with the simple, powerful authority of a man who had lost everything. Olav Jensen said, "They're trying to pick us off, one by one. They're counting on us to be too scared, too ashamed to fight back. The bank wants our land. This new company, OmniGen, wants our future. It's the same story, just a different name on the letterhead. We can't prove it yet. But we all know, we know in our bones that Providence did this to us, and we cannot let them get away with it." They decided to pool their resources, what little they had left, and hire a lawyer. A young, hungry lawyer from a small town nearby who was willing to take the case on contingency. They were going to sue the Providence Agricultural Cooperative for fraud and damages. It was a David and Goliath fight. A handful of ruined farmers against a shadowy nonprofit with seemingly endless resources. They had no hard evidence, only the unwavering conviction of the betrayed. Dr. Thorne said, "Rebecca, I found it. It took some digging, calling in favors I haven't used in 20 years. The polymer, it's not a direct match to anything on the commercial market, but the base structure, the molecular spine, it's a patent, a developmental patent filed 8 years ago." "By who?" Rebecca asked, her heart pounding. Dr. Thorne said, "A shell corporation, registered in Delaware. But I pulled their registration documents. The parent company, the one that owns the shell, it's OmniGen Agricorp." The line went silent for a moment as the implications settled over Rebecca. The ghost in the machine now had a name. The philanthropic nonprofit and the predatory corporation were connected. This wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't an accident. It was a conspiracy. She now held the first concrete piece of evidence tying the miracle seeds to the corporate giant that was conveniently poised to profit from the disaster. But it was a tenuous thread. A patent for a chemical isn't proof of its use in a criminal enterprise. To win, they would need more. They would need to find the source. They would need a witness. They would need to find Dr. Anneliese Schmidt, a woman who had vanished into thin air, a ghost haunted by her own genius. The final shot is of Rebecca's corkboard map. She takes a red marker and draws a bold, sharp line, connecting the pin for the Providence Cooperative to a new pin she stabs into the board, labeled Omnigen. We see a montage of sleek corporate Omnigen advertisements from the late 1980s. Smiling actors portraying farmers stand in impossibly lush fields. The ads promise security, reliability, and the future of farming. The jingle is upbeat and optimistic. While Rebecca Morrison was connecting the dots in her small Wisconsin office, Lawrence Ravencroft was winning the war. By the spring of 1989, Omnigen's takeover of the region was a stunning success. Over 60% of the farms that had once partnered with the Providence Cooperative were now under contract with Omnigen. Ravencroft's dependency conversion was complete. He was lauded in the financial press as a visionary, a master strategist who had turned a regional blight into a corporate triumph. The financial cost to the farmers was staggering, an estimated $80 million in lost crops and devalued land across the affected counties, a hole from which many would never recover. The lawsuit filed by Olaf Jensen and the small consortium of holdout farmers was struggling. Providence Cooperative's lawyers, a high-priced team secretly paid by Omnigen, buried them in paperwork. Motions to dismiss, endless discovery requests, depositions designed to intimidate and exhaust the farmers. They painted Olaf and the others as disgruntled, incompetent farmers looking for a scapegoat for their own failures. Rebecca's discovery of the patent link was presented as circumstantial, a desperate attempt to link a benevolent non-profit to an unrelated corporation. They were bleeding the farmers dry, legally and financially. Hope was dwindling. The scene shifts. We are in a dusty, sun-bleached town in rural Oregon, a diner with a flickering neon sign. Inside, a woman with short-cropped hair and weary eyes wipes down the counter. It is Anneliese Schmidt, now living under the name Anna Smith. The key to it all, Dr. Anneliese Schmidt, was 3,000 miles away, living a life of self-imposed exile. She had drifted west, taking odd jobs, waitressing, working in a motel laundry, anything that paid cash and kept her anonymous. She had shed her identity as a brilliant scientist and adopted the quiet, invisible life of a drifter. But she could not escape her conscience. Every night, she was tormented by nightmares. She saw the faces of the farmers she had read about in old newspapers she found in bus stations. She saw the chemical diagrams of her own creation, twisting into monstrous shapes. She had created a poison, and the guilt was its own slow-acting venom, eating away at her soul. She followed the news of the Wisconsin lawsuit from a distance, reading about it in the library, her heart aching for the people she had inadvertently ruined. She knew her testimony could blow the case wide open, but the fear Ravencroft had instilled in her was a physical presence. He was a man who didn't leave loose ends. To come forward was, in her mind, a death sentence. Back in Wisconsin, Rebecca Morrison and the farmer's young lawyer, a man named Ben Carter, are in a cramped office, poring over documents. Rebecca Morrison refused to give up. The patent was the key. She was sure of it. She and the farmer's lawyer, Ben Carter, spent weeks trying to punch through the corporate veil. They subpoenaed documents, but everything led to dead-end shell corporations, or was blocked by high-powered legal teams citing proprietary information. "They've built a fortress, Rebecca," Ben said, rubbing his tired eyes. "Legally, Providence and Omnigen are two completely separate entities. The patent is for a chemical, not a seed. We can't prove it was ever used. We need an inside source. We need the person who designed this." His words hung in the air. The inventor listed on the patent was A. Schmidt. There was no first name, just an initial, a deliberate move by Ravencroft to obscure the identity of his most crucial asset. They ran searches for every botanist, every chemist named Schmidt, who had worked for Omnigen or any of its known subsidiaries. The list was long, and every lead went cold. It was like searching for a ghost. Rebecca's investigative instincts took over. If she couldn't find the scientist, maybe she could find her shadow. She went back to the beginning, to the founding of the Providence Cooperative. She pulled the original incorporation papers, the early press releases, and the brochures. She was looking for a pattern, an overlooked connection. Rebecca is scanning microfiche in a library basement. She zooms in on an old local newspaper article from 1986, a puff piece about the launch of the Providence Cooperative's seed ark. And then she found it. A single sentence in a forgotten article, a quote from an unnamed project director at the cooperative's launch event, praising the visionary work of our lead botanist, whose genius has made this entire project possible. The director mentioned the botanist had been recruited from a prestigious post at Cornell University. It was a breadcrumb, a tiny, almost insignificant clue. Working with Ben Carter, they sent a formal inquiry to Cornell's botany department, requesting a list of all faculty and senior researchers who had left their positions between 1984 and 1986. The university, citing privacy concerns, initially refused. But Ben, armed with a subpoena from the lawsuit, pressed them. After a week of bureaucratic wrangling, they received a short list of names. On that list was one name that made Rebecca's breath catch in her throat. Dr. Anneliese Schmidt. They had a name, a full name. Now the ghost had an identity. They started digging into her life. They found her academic papers, her photo in a university prospectus. They discovered she had resigned abruptly, citing a private sector research opportunity. They tracked her to the city where OmniGen was headquartered, and then the trail vanished. Her credit cards were canceled. Her apartment was leased to new tenants. Her mail was returned to the sender. She had simply disappeared around the same time the blight began its devastation. "She's running," Rebecca said to Ben, staring at the photo of the earnest, intelligent woman. "She's not a villain in this. She's a victim too, or at the very least a witness who got scared." But how do you find someone who doesn't want to be found? This was before the internet as we know it. There was no social media, no digital footprint to follow. Rebecca had an idea. It was a long shot, a wild guess based on a psychological profile she was building in her mind. Anneliese was a scientist, a specialist in botany. If she was hiding, she might seek solace in the familiar, in a place of immense biodiversity, a place where one could get lost in nature, a place as far away from the corporate towers of the East Coast and the ruined fields of the Midwest as possible. She pulled out a map of the United States and looked west, to the vast, sprawling national forests of the Pacific Northwest. The camera focuses on a flyer Rebecca is designing on her computer. It's simple and discreet. It has a picture of Dr. Anneliese Schmidt from her university days. Rebecca and Ben pooled their money, a few $100s from her own pocket, and the last dregs of the farmer's legal fund. They created a simple flyer. It didn't mention OmniGen or the lawsuit. It was carefully worded to sound like a personal appeal. The flyer reads, "Seeking information on the whereabouts of Dr. Anneliese Schmidt, formerly of Cornell University. An old colleague is trying to reconnect regarding important academic matters. Please contact," followed by a post office box and a new, untraceable phone number they had set up. They printed 500 copies. They mailed them not to police departments, but to every agricultural extension office, every university botany department, every major arboretum, and every forestry service station in Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. It was a message in a bottle, thrown into a vast ocean of green. They were hoping that someone, somewhere in the quiet world of professional botanists, might have seen her. Weeks pass. The montage shows the farmer's struggle continuing. An auctioneer's gavel falls. Olaf Jensen looks on, his face like stone. The flyers are shown being pinned to dusty bulletin boards in faraway offices, and then ignored. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. Nothing. The legal case was on the verge of collapse. The farmers were beginning to lose heart. It seemed their desperate gamble had failed. Then, one rainy Tuesday, the phone rang. The scene is Rebecca's office. She snatches up the phone. The man on the other end had a quiet, hesitant voice. He was the head arborist at a botanical garden outside of Portland, Oregon. The arborist said, "Hello, I'm calling about the flyer. For Dr. Schmidt? I think I might know her. Or, well, a woman who looks just like that picture. She calls herself Anna, works at a diner down the road. She comes in here on her days off, just to walk among the trees. She's quiet. Seems to know a lot about plants, though. Asked me a question once about a specific type of root rot that nobody's asked me in 30 years. Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs. It had to be her. "Where is this diner?" she asked, her voice tight with excitement. "What's the name of it?" Rebecca hangs up the phone. She looks at Ben Carter with an expression of fierce, unblinking determination. The hunt was over. The confrontation was about to begin. They had found the ghost. Now they had to convince her to speak. Rebecca Morrison knew that this was the single most important moment in the entire case. It wasn't about legal arguments or scientific data anymore. It was about reaching a terrified woman who held the truth and convincing her that justice was worth the risk. She booked a flight to Portland the next day, carrying with her the hopes of hundreds of ruined families. The fate of everything now rested on a conversation in a roadside diner, 3,000 miles from the crime. The scene opens with the blurry, rain-streaked window of a moving car. The landscape of the Pacific Northwest flashes by, all deep greens and misty grays. Rebecca Morrison is in the passenger seat of a rental car, her face set and determined. Ben Carter is driving. The flight to Portland was the longest of Rebecca Morrison's life. Every mile that passed stretched the fragile thread of hope thinner. What if the arborist was wrong? What if Anna Smith was just a woman who bore a passing resemblance to a faded photograph? Or worse, what if she was Annalise Schmidt, but refused to talk? What if the fear Desta, Lawrence Ravencroft, had instilled in her was too powerful to overcome? They found the diner just as the arborist had described it, a small, unassuming place off a 2-lane highway, nestled between towering Douglas firs. A thin plume of smoke rose from its chimney into the damp Oregon air. It looked like 1,000 other roadside stops, a place for transients and truckers, a perfect place to disappear. They sat in the car for a long moment, the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers counting down the seconds. This couldn't be a confrontation. It couldn't be an ambush. Ben Carter, the lawyer, understood he had to stay in the car. A lawsuit was a threat. Rebecca, the fellow scientist, the woman from the fields, was the only one who had a chance of breaking through. Rebecca gets out of the car, pulling her coat tight against the drizzling rain. She pushes open the diner door. A small bell jingles. The interior is dimly lit and smells of coffee and fried bacon. Inside, the diner was quiet. A few truckers hunched over their meals at the counter. And there, behind the counter, wiping it down with a damp cloth, was a woman with short-cropped hair and the haunted, weary eyes from the photo. It was her, Dr. Annalise Schmidt. She looked up as Rebecca entered, her expression one of polite, professional indifference, but her eyes flickered with a brief, hunted look. Rebecca slid onto a stool at the far end of the counter. Annalise approached, a coffee pot in her hand. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of its former academic confidence. "Please," Rebecca said quietly, "and a moment of your time, Dr. Schmidt." The coffee pot trembles, just for a second, splashing a small amount of coffee onto the counter. Her face turns to a pale, waxy mask. The professional indifference shatters, replaced by raw, unadulterated fear. "I think you have me mistaken for someone else," Annalise whispered, her voice barely audible. She started to turn away. "Your work on Fusarium strains at Cornell was groundbreaking," Rebecca continued, her voice calm and steady, not letting her go. "Especially your research into latent catalysts, the way a secondary chemical compound could trigger a dormant gene. It was brilliant." Annalise froze, her back to Rebecca. She knew this wasn't a random encounter. The past had found her. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice tight. I do, Rebecca replied softly. I'm the county extension agent for Walworth County, Wisconsin. I've spent the last year walking through fields that your brilliant work destroyed. I've sat at kitchen tables with families who have lost everything. I've seen the foreclosure notices. I've smelled the rot. Annalise slowly turns around. Her eyes are filled with a terrible mixture of fear and something else, a desperate, aching guilt. Tears well up. They told me it was a failsafe. Annalise choked out, the words tumbling out as if a dam had broken. A genetic lock to protect the seed bank's integrity. I never knew what he was going to do, what they were going to do. Lawrence Ravencroft, Rebecca said. It wasn't a question. Annalise just nodded, tears now streaming down her face. She sank onto the stool opposite Rebecca, her waitress apron seeming like a ridiculous costume. The scientist, the genius, was finally re-emerging from the shell of Anna Smith. He's a monster, Annalise whispered. He took my research, my life's work, and he twisted it into a weapon. When I found out, when I confronted him, he threatened me, not with words, with silence, with looks. He had my apartment broken into. They took all my research, all my proof. I ran. I just ran. Over the next hour, in the quiet corner of that rainy diner, Dr. Annalise Schmidt confessed everything. She told Rebecca about Ravencroft's masterful deception, how he preyed on her ideals. She explained the science, the diabolical two-stage mechanism of the tainted seeds, the sterilant, the blight, the chemical trigger. She described with chilling precision how the system was designed to create a catastrophe that only Omnigen could solve. She was the missing piece, the ghost who could testify. She was the link between the humanitarian Providence and the predatory Omnigen. She was the murder weapon, finally telling its story. They have a lawsuit, Rebecca told her gently. A handful of farmers. They're about to lose. Your testimony. It would change everything. It would give them a fighting chance. Fear flooded Annalise's eyes again. You don't understand what he's capable of. He won't let me testify. He'll find me. He'll silence me for good this time. You've been silent for 2 years, Rebecca countered, her voice firm but compassionate. And it's been eating you alive. You haven't been free. You've been in a prison of your own making. Ravencroft wins as long as you stay hidden, as long as you let fear control you. The only way to truly be free is to face him, to tell the truth. Ben Carter enters the diner and approaches the counter. He places a business card down next to Annalise's hand. Dr. Schmidt, Ben said softly. My name is Ben Carter. I represent the Jensen family and 14 other families who have lost their farms. We can protect you. We can file for witness protection. We will have federal marshals guarding you every step of the way. You will not be alone in this. Annalise looked from Rebecca's earnest face to Ben's determined one. She looked at the business card, and then she looked out the window at the relentless, cleansing rain. For the first time in years, she saw a path that wasn't just running away. It was a path toward redemption. Okay, she said, her voice trembling but clear. I'll do it. The scene shifts dramatically. We are now in a formal courtroom setting. The atmosphere is tense. Olav Jensen and the other farmers sit on one side looking worn but resolute. On the other side is a phalanx of expensive lawyers. Lawrence Ravencroft sits behind them, looking utterly unconcerned, almost bored. The news that the plaintiffs had found a surprise witness, a former Omnigen scientist, sent a shockwave through the legal proceedings. Ravencroft's lawyers filed a flurry of motions to have her testimony thrown out, claiming she was a disgruntled former employee with a vendetta. But the judge, his interest piqued by this sudden turn, allowed it. The day Annalise Schmidt walked into that courtroom, flanked by 2 stone-faced U.S. Marshals, the air crackled with electricity. When she took the stand, Lawrence Ravencroft's mask of bored indifference finally slipped. For a fleeting second, his eyes met hers across the courtroom, and his expression was one of pure, cold fury. He had been so sure he had buried her. Ben Carter began his questioning simply, establishing her credentials, her work at Cornell, her recruitment to the Providence Project. Then he led her step by step through the science of the poisoned seeds. Ben Carter said, "Dr. Schmidt, could you please explain to the court, in your own words, the nature of the genetic failsafe you were tasked with creating?" Annalise Schmidt said, "It wasn't a failsafe. It was a two-part biological weapon. The first component was a chemical sterilant applied to the seed coat, designed to be absorbed into the embryo and render the second-generation seeds infertile. The second component was a genetically modified fungal blight, Fusarium corrumperat, a strain I engineered to remain dormant until it came into contact with the decaying sterilant from a planted second-generation seed. The sterilant itself was the trigger for the blight." A murmur went through the courtroom. She wasn't just claiming it was sabotage. She was explaining the exact, elegant, evil mechanism of how it was done. She provided the chemical formulas, the genetic sequences, and the project timelines. She presented the truth with the irrefutable clarity of its creator. She connected the Providence Cooperative directly to the OmniGen labs where she worked. She identified the specific OmniGen patent for the chemical sterilant, the very patent Rebecca had discovered, as the one she had used. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brutal. He tried to paint her as unstable, a fantasist, a failure who was fired for incompetence, but he couldn't shake her story because it was the truth. Her scientific precision was her shield. The final, devastating blow came when Ben Carter played a tape. Ben Carter, "Dr. Schmidt, before you fled, did you happen to make any personal recordings for your own records?" Annalise Schmidt, "I did. I kept an audio journal of my progress." Ben presses play on a tape recorder. A scratchy but clear recording fills the courtroom. It is Annalise's voice from years ago, full of scientific excitement. Annalise. Log entry, April 12, 1985. A breakthrough. Mr. Ravencroft's suggestion to use the decaying polymer as the catalyst was unorthodox, but brilliant. It creates a perfect closed-loop system. The very agent that ensures the Gert's efficacy in Generation 1 becomes the trigger for the blight in Generation 2. It's a truly elegant piece of bioengineering. He's calling it market security, a fascinating term. The courtroom was utterly silent. There it was, Ravencroft's own words, market security, from the mouth of his own scientist, recorded years before the crime was ever discovered. It was the nail in the coffin. Lawrence Ravencroft, for the first time, looked like a man trapped. The intricate web of lies he had woven for years had just been set on fire by the one person he thought he had extinguished. The ghost had returned, and she had brought hell with her. Lawrence Ravencroft's face. His mask is gone. All that remains is the cold, hard face of a predator who has just been caught. The scene opens on the stoic, weathered face of Olaf Jensen, sitting in the courtroom. As the audio from Annalise's tape fades, a single tear traces a path through the dust and lines on his cheek. It's a tear of vindication, of grief, of a terrible, righteous anger finally finding its voice. Annalise Schmidt's testimony was not just a crack in Lawrence Ravencroft's fortress. It was a seismic charge that shattered its foundations. The audio log, with its chilling mention of market security, changed everything. The civil lawsuit, once a desperate David and Goliath struggle, was now the epicenter of a burgeoning criminal investigation. The U.S. Attorney's Office, which had previously ignored the farmer's plight, was now forced to act. Federal investigators descended on the case, armed with Annalise's testimony as their roadmap. The first domino to fall was Elias Thorne, the local manager of the Providence Cooperative. The true believer who had sold the poisoned hope to his own neighbors, was brought in for questioning. Confronted with Annalise's evidence, his faith crumbled into horrified realization. He had not been a savior. He had been a pawn. His genuine love for his community twisted into the perfect tool for its destruction. In a tearful, hours-long deposition, Thorne gave the investigators everything he had, every contact, every directive from the shadowy upper management, every transport ledger for the seeds. He was a broken man, but his testimony forged the first steel link in the chain, connecting the fields of Wisconsin to Ravencroft's office. A montage of swift, decisive action. FBI agents in windbreakers are seen raiding the now-defunct Providence Cooperative offices, carrying out boxes of documents. Other agents are seen at a port, inspecting shipping manifests. The pace is quick and powerful. Armed with warrants, federal agents executed a series of coordinated raids. They hit the shuttered Providence offices, seizing the meticulously kept ledgers that detailed the distribution of over 40,000 seed packets to more than 500 family farms, a perfect record of the crime scale. They seized OmniGen's internal servers, financial records, and most importantly, the lab records from Annalise's old department. The forensic accountants and data recovery specialists went to work. They unearthed a complex web of shell corporations and offshore accounts, a labyrinth designed to launder money from OmniGen's corporate accounts to fund the philanthropic Providence Cooperative. They found the payments to the high-priced lawyers, the funding for the benevolent town hall meetings, the salary of Elias Thorne, all originating from OmniGen. The corporate veil was not just pierced, it was torn to shreds. They proved that Providence was, from its inception, nothing more than a Black Ops division of OmniGen. The final, damning piece of physical evidence came not from a computer, but from the Earth itself. On the word of Elias Thorne, investigators were led to a location that wasn't on any official map. The original vault, the so-called Ark. Heavy machinery is used to pull open the massive, sealed door of the underground vault. Investigators in hazmat suits enter, their flashlights cutting through the darkness and illuminating the rows and rows of seed drawers. When the FBI's forensic agricultural team entered the climate-controlled vault in 2003, nearly 15 years after the last of the seeds were distributed, they found a pristine, silent testament to the crime. It was a time capsule of premeditated evil. Drawer after drawer was filled with the original tainted seeds, a library of carefully catalogued poison. Lab tests on these preserved seeds were conclusive. They were a perfect match to the dead plants from Rebecca Morrison's samples. They contained the exact chemical sterilant from the OmniGen patent, and when cultured, they produced the exact hyper-aggressive strain of Fusarium corrumperate that Annalise Schmidt had described. The crime scene preserved by Ravencroft's own hubris now served as his indictment. Lawrence Ravencroft was arrested not at his corporate headquarters, but at his palatial estate in Connecticut. He was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of cold reptilian fury. He showed no remorse, only contempt for the system that had finally caught him. The charge was not just fraud. Armed with the evidence of a conspiracy that had crossed state lines and resulted in over $100 million in damages, the U.S. attorney charged him and 3 other OmniGen executives under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the RICO Act. They were being tried as organized criminals. The camera focuses on Rebecca Morrison, watching a news report of Ravencroft's arrest on a small TV in her office. Her expression is not one of triumph, but of profound, weary relief. The trial was a sensation. It peeled back the curtain on the ruthless, dark heart of corporate ambition. Annalise Schmidt, no longer a ghost but a confident, composed witness, was the prosecution's star. She walked the jury through the science, her testimony unshakable. Rebecca Morrison followed, presenting the meticulous fieldwork, the discovery of the patent, the human cost of the crime she had uncovered through sheer tenacity. Olav Jensen, his voice heavy but strong, represented the farmers, telling the simple, devastating story of betrayal. The defense argued that Ravencroft was a visionary CEO, unaware of the actions of a rogue scientist. They tried to paint Annalise as the sole perpetrator, a mad genius who acted alone. But the mountain of financial evidence and the corroborating testimony of Elias Thorne made that argument collapse under its own weight. After a 6-week trial, the jury took less than 5 hours to reach a verdict. The courtroom. The jury foreman stands to read the verdict. Close up on Ravencroft's impassive face, jury foreman said, "On the charge of racketeering conspiracy, the jury found the defendant, Lawrence Ravencroft, guilty. On the charge of wire fraud, the jury found the defendant guilty. On the charge of mail fraud, the jury found the defendant guilty." The list went on. Guilty on all 18 counts. Lawrence Ravencroft was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison, a sentence that, for the 62-year-old CEO, was effectively a life sentence. He would die in prison 19 years later, never having admitted his guilt. His co-conspirators received lesser, but still substantial sentences. The aftermath was complex and bittersweet. Omni-Gen, gutted by scandal and facing crippling fines, was forced into bankruptcy. A massive civil settlement was established, totaling $150 million, to be paid out to the more than 500 farm families identified in the Providence ledgers. For some, it was enough to save their farms. For many others, who had already lost their land years before, it was a hollow monetary apology for a stolen heritage. The money could not restore the lost years, the shame, the broken families, or the suicides that had occurred during the darkest days of the crisis. The Providence Agricultural Cooperative became a byword for corporate evil, a chilling case study taught in business ethics and law classes. It led to new regulations, the Agricultural Truth in Philanthropy Act, requiring greater transparency for nonprofits with ties to for-profit corporations in the agricultural sector. Rebecca Morrison became something of a quiet legend within the Department of Agriculture, lauded for her integrity and relentless pursuit of the truth. She continued her work as a county agent, forever dedicated to the farmers she had fought for. Dr. Annalise Schmidt, granted immunity for her testimony, vanished again, but this time on her own terms. She changed her name for good and, using a small portion of the witness protection funds, bought a small, secluded plot of land in a quiet corner of the country. There, she began her life's work anew, building a small, private seed bank, a true Ark, dedicated to preserving the very biodiversity she had once been manipulated into almost destroying. It was her penance and her peace. The land healed, the seasons turned, but the memory of the Ark of Barren Seeds never truly faded. It became a dark legend, a cautionary tale whispered from one generation of farmers to the next, a story about the danger of hope when it is offered by men who see people not as souls, but as figures on a balance sheet. It stands as a terrifying reminder that the most devastating crimes are often not committed with a gun, but with a pen, a patent, and a promise that is too good to be true. Reclaimed Wisconsin countryside. A new generation of farmers, perhaps the grandchild of one of the original victims, inspects a healthy crop. The sun is setting, casting a long, golden light. The feeling is one of peace, but the accompanying music is somber and reflective, hinting at the scars that lie beneath the surface. In the end, justice was served, at least the kind of justice our system is capable of delivering. Lawrence Ravencroft died behind bars. A corporation was dismantled. A settlement was paid. On paper, the case of the Providence Agricultural Cooperative, the dark saga of the Ark of Barren Seeds, is closed. The files are archived, the verdicts rendered, the history written, but for those who lived it, for the communities fractured by a calculated corporate plague, the story never truly ends. The dust never fully settles. The money, when it finally arrived years later, was a bandage on a wound that had already scarred over. It could not buy back a family farm sold at auction in 1989. It could not erase the shame of a good man who had to take a factory job to feed his children. It could not bring back the neighbors who, overwhelmed by debt and despair, took their own lives in the silence of their barns. The check from the settlement was not a victory, it was an epitaph. The legacy of the crime is not found in court documents, but in the soil itself. For a generation, a deep-seated, almost genetic distrust of outsiders was sown into the community, a skepticism of anything that seems too good to be true, a suspicion of any promise of a free lunch. When new agricultural technologies are introduced, when new corporate partners come calling, the old-timers look at each other, and the ghost of Providence hangs in the air between them. It is a cautionary tale that has become part of their DNA. The most profound legacy, however, is a question that still haunts the quiet corners of agricultural science and corporate ethics. How many other Providence projects have there been? How many other benevolent foundations are merely the smiling masks of corporate predators? Ravencroft's crime was exposed only because of a perfect storm. The tenacity of one county agent, the conscience of one scientist, and the stubbornness of a handful of farmers who refused to surrender. How many other schemes have succeeded, their victims simply accepting their ruin as bad luck or their own failure? The truth buried forever under layers of corporate plausible deniability. The screen shows a series of modern-day headlines about controversies in the food and agricultural industry, patent disputes over seeds, questions about the safety of new chemicals, consolidation of food companies into massive conglomerates. Ravencroft's methods were monstrous, but his motive was chillingly simple: total market control. He didn't just want to sell a product, he wanted to eliminate all other choices. He wanted to own the entire ecosystem, from the seed to the shelf. This is a story from the 1980s, but does that ambition sound unfamiliar today? When a handful of giant corporations control the vast majority of the world's seed supply, when farmers are locked into contracts that forbid them from saving their own seeds, is the ghost of Lawrence Ravencroft truly gone? Or has his market security philosophy simply become the quiet, accepted cost of doing business? His crime was to create a dependency through a manufactured catastrophe. Today, one has to ask, are the dependencies we see now in our food system, on chemicals, on patented genes, on global supply chains, any less binding? We just accept them as normal. The Ark of Barren Seeds was a conspiracy of incredible evil, but it was also a warning that the things most essential to our survival, the seeds that feed us, the soil that sustains us, the trust we place in our institutions, are also the most vulnerable to corruption. It reminds us that the most dangerous monsters don't always lurk in the shadows with knives. Sometimes they sit in boardrooms, shielded by wealth and power, and wield weapons made of paper, promises, and the quiet, patient corruption of a single, tiny seed. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that the consolidation of our food supply by a few powerful corporations is a modern-day version of Ravenscroft's ambition? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling and want to hear more stories about America's hidden criminal history, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the importance of uncovering buried truths. Until next time, remember that the most important stories are often the ones that powerful people hoped would never be told.